So I've heard some rather alarming reports recently of highly toxic nerve agents being dumped into British waterways. I'm here on the banks of this idyllic river with expert Matt Shardlow to see if we can get to the bottom of what's going on. So Matt, tell me a bit more about these nerve agents I've heard about in UK rivers.
Well, what we're talking about here, Jay, is flea treatments. These are products that people buy and put on their pets, but they're getting into all sorts of places they shouldn't be, including into our rivers.
So what are these flea treatments?
Well, there's 22 different sorts of chemicals that are authorised in the UK to use as flea treatments on people's pets. And these are often highly toxic insecticides. Some of them, like fipronil and imidacloprid, are chemicals that are already banned in agriculture because they're so toxic. They are really, really toxic. These are agents that get into insects and disrupt their nervous systems. If you can remember Novichok and the fact that people just touching a bottle that had Novichok in it could give them enough poison to cause severe illness and death. It's the same here. We're talking tiny, tiny amounts. In one of the chemicals is so toxic that impacts on wildlife start to happen at the same sort of concentration as if you had 1 grain of sand in an Olympic swimming pool. And by the time you get up to a drop of one of these chemicals in a swimming pool, you're at a level where half of the flies in that water body, so if this was, imagine this river, and a section of this river with 1 drop of this chemical in, that'd be enough to kill 50% of the fly life in that river. Incredibly tiny amounts with massive levels of toxicity.
What's the impact of these chemicals on a river such as this one we're walking beside now?
Well, the species that are most sensitive to these chemicals are things like dragonflies and mayflies and caddisflies, the real, proper flying invertebrate life of these rivers. They're really threatened by these chemicals, and at tiny amounts it'll cause all sorts of impacts. At a certain level it causes their death, but below those levels it stops them reproducing effectively, it stops them emerging as adults, it reduces their ability to feed and to function. These nerve agents having a massive effect on all sorts of different groups of organisms living in our rivers and countryside.
So you mentioned there are 22 licensed chemicals. Which of these are we most worried about when it comes to flea treatments?
Well, the ones that are used most widely, on our 10-odd million cats and 10-odd million dogs, are chemicals called fipronil and imidacloprid. These are the banned insecticides. There are also other ones like fruolana, foxolana, even dimpilate, which is also known as diazinon. These are highly toxic chemicals, all of them, and they're really difficult to control and keep safe.
So these chemicals, how do they work?
Well, different ways, but most of them work by being nerve toxins. So they are picked up and absorbed by the different animals, and they get into the system and they block the nerves so that their nervous system effectively stops working. In some cases they excite the nerves so that the nervous system is overstimulated. Whichever way they work, they effectively accumulate, blocking those nerve endings and making that animal start to dysfunction. And that can mean killing them at very, very low levels, and it can also mean causing them harm and causing them to fail to breed, causing genetic disruption in those species as well. So depending on the chemical, they all work in slightly different ways, but the main ones, they're nerve agents. They're affecting the abilities of these species, these animals, to function in any way whatsoever.
So, Matt, if these chemicals are so toxic, how come they're safe to put on pets?
Well, different groups of animals have very different nerve transmitters These agents are targeted at the nerves of insects and other invertebrates and do not have the same profound effect on mammal nerves, which is not to say that they're benign. Indeed, the Environment Agency has assessed all the chemicals polluting rivers and rated fipronil as the greatest current toxic threat to humans.
So what actually happens to these chemicals once they're in the environment?
Well, most of them are highly persistent, so they last for a long time. They accumulate in sediments and they accumulate in animals. Some of them are neonicotinoid insecticides that used to be used in agriculture. Other ones are what's known as PFAS chemicals. So that's polyfluoroalkyl chemicals. They are very persistent, very toxic, and they build up in the environment, building up in the tissues of the plants and the animals in the environment, and causing long-term damage to ecosystems.
So I thought I'd come down to my local Tesco's just to see what kind of flea treatments they've got in stock and learn a little bit more about how these packages are labelled and what's inside. So let's have a little look. So we're here with my dog Tanny, and we've got the treatment here that we picked up from the supermarket earlier on in Tesco's, and we're just going to talk a little bit about application. So usually the flea treatment is just dropped along the back of the neck of the dog.
Well, but perhaps worth just saying that, you know, once you put it on the back of the neck, it doesn't stay there, obviously. It travels, so it travels through the dog's fur, and it goes into the skin and goes inside the dog, so the chemical effectively becomes systematic within the whole animal. Some of that chemical is released from fur, is dropped. Some of the chemical comes out in urine, some comes out in the other toiletries, and some of it rubs off. So when we're doing this and stroking the pet like this with our hands, you know, even 28 days after the pet's been treated, you're still ending up with the chemical on your hand, and then when you go and wash your hand, it goes straight down the sink.
So should we have a little look at the package then? I mean, you know, I thought we saw it in the shop. It looks pretty okay. There's nothing scary about it. You know, it says kills the fleas, ticks and lice. There's no big warnings or anything. It says not to use it in rabbits.
Yeah, you might expect, you know, given how toxic thing is known to be in aquatic environments, you might expect there to be one of those orange labels, you know, those scary labels with the dead tree and the dead fish saying, watch out, this is a dangerous toxin.
You would think so.
You only get those on chemicals that are regulated by the Health and Safety Executive, and as veterinary medicines, these are not regulated by the Health and Safety Executive. In fact, they're regulated by a small organisation called the Veterinary Medicines Directorate, and they don't put those sorts of warnings on their products.
No. So as the purchaser, you know, at the point of purchase, I would have no idea that there was anything dangerous or harmful about this.
Yeah.
So I bought it, you know, based on the packaging information, for external use only, for animal treatment only, keep out of sight and reach of children. There's nothing there to tell me that this is harmful.
Nothing to say there's any issue with the environment.
Apart from harmful to fleas, ticks and lice. So why don't we have a little look what's inside. Okay, so there's a bit more information in here. So any warnings? User warnings. People with known allergies to insecticides or alcohol to avoid it. Product can cause irritation of the mouth, lips and eyes. Avoid the product coming into contact with the fingers. Well, that's going to be difficult if you're going to pet your dog, isn't it? If this occurs, wash hands with soap and water. After accidental contact with eyes, rinse carefully. Wash hands after use.
But I mean, those are ways guaranteed to make sure that the chemical's getting down into the sewage works and into the sea. The actual advice that's on there, advice that's mandated by the Veterinary Medicines Directorate, they're effectively inviting you to wash the product down the sink.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah. Kills fleas for up to 2 months and ticks for up to 1 month. Well, that indicates that it's present on the body for 2 months at least.
Would be the hint that they know
inference
that this
yeah.
is a very persistent and toxic chemical.
I'm struggling to find anything here that would warn me that this is alarming for the environment.
Well, the Veterinary Medicines Director do reassure us that they are putting information to warn people on the things, but maybe it's just in such small print you can't see it, Jay.
Well, maybe I'm not going to rule out. I mean, I can't see anything here on there that would be particularly alarming. So we've got 1 pipette's worth here that's come in the packaging. We can see that there's the liquid content there in that little vial.
I've managed to find it, Jay. So here you go. It's this little bit here. You read that.
I see. Fipronil may harm fish and other water creatures. Do not contaminate ponds, waterways, or ditches with the product or empty containers. Do not allow dogs to swim in ponds or other waterways for 2 days after treatment.
There you go.
Well, based on what we've been talking about so far, that sounds wholly inadequate.
Well, I mean, it is. We know the products are on the pets for a month. It almost says that elsewhere on the packet. So I don't know why 2 days is on there. They're clearly toxic for a lot longer than that. And it only says that it may harm the aquatic environment. It may harm aquatic creatures. We know absolutely certainly that it does cause huge toxic damage to aquatic creatures and ecosystems. Why is the public not being told this information?
Yeah, it's quite alarming, really. I mean, to be able to just go to your local shop, you're not getting any counselling really on what this is, how it works, what the long-term effects are for the wider environment. We'll come to talk about what you think, what the best solutions are to dealing with this problem, but just at the perspective of a consumer who's purchased this today, I would really be none the wiser as to there being any significant harms associated with its use. And it seems that there are some very simple measures you could take to avoid it, in fact, if we were to follow that advice, it would not reduce that risk.
It would have a very small impact. In fact, if you massively increase that advice, you still wouldn't actually solve the issue. And we've talked to a number of dog owners today, and none of them were aware that this was an issue, despite this tiny text on here. They haven't read it. They haven't realised that there's an issue. And some scientific research done last year actually around Hampstead Heath, which showed that the ponds in Hampstead Heath are heavily polluted with flea treatments. But they also found that 86% of the dog owners were completely unaware that there was any aquatic toxicity issue at all.
And I think we've seen that today in some of the conversations we've had with people out and about with their dogs.
Yeah.
So what about products or materials in the home that are coming into contact with dogs that have been treated with these chemicals? What effect can that have?
Yeah, well, we've read the packaging, Jay, and there's nothing really there that raises any concerns around those issues. In fact, it says you should wash your hands after you've come into contact with it. It doesn't say wash your hands after stroking a pet, but that's one of the major routes into the environment is through hand washing. But there are other routes as well. So if you've got a pet cat and it's sat on your lap, that chemical will rub off onto your clothes. And when you put your clothes into the washing machine, again a direct route out through the sewage straight into the rivers. Another really key one is bedding. People have cat and dog beds. Those beds will get absolutely full of contaminated fur. The flea treatment will rub off on that material. People put that into their washing machine. And this is happening millions of times all over the UK every month. And vast amounts of these chemicals are getting off clothes, getting off hands, getting off pet bedding, and getting out into the sewage system and out into the environment as a result.
So Matt, we're at a local sewage treatment plant where these chemicals are coming down the pipes from people's homes. Is the treatment plant going to remove those chemicals?
No. So there's been quite a bit of work on this. Treatment plants like this, with standard methods of treatment, do not remove fipronil or imidacloprid from the sewage. In fact, levels of these chemicals can be higher coming out of the sewage plant than going in. How does that happen? Well, these chemicals, they break down into highly toxic breakdown compounds. Sometimes the breakdown compounds are even more toxic than the original chemicals themselves. And when they get to the sewage treatment plant, some of those chemicals are actually converted back into the original chemicals. So for instance, fipronil sulfide, one of the chemical breakdown products of fipronil, also another PFAS chemical, when that goes through sewage works, some of that gets converted back into fipronil. So the sewage coming out of here has just as much flea treatment in as the sewage going into the sewage works.
Is there a way to treat that sewage to actually remove the chemicals?
Yeah, so there are methods that have been shown to work with some of these chemicals. So for instance, there are bioactive filters, membranes that can be put in that will filter out the chemicals. There's also carbon activated treatment where you have beds of activated carbon, you pass the water through that, and a lot of these chemicals come out into that carbon and can then be disposed of elsewhere. But basically those things are really expensive to do. There are 9,000 sewage treatment plants in the UK. It would cost tens of billions to convert all of those sewage treatment plants into the condition where they can actually deal with those chemicals coming into the sewage treatment plants. It would also add about £400 million every year to the cost of treating that sewage. All of these costs would be passed on to the average member of the public who's buying water and sewage treatment services. So yes, it is possible to develop sewage treatment plants, but it'll cost tens of billions and take many decades. It's really not a fix to this urgent problem.
So we're here at the outfall point from the sewage treatment works. What happens to all these chemicals at this point, Matt, once they start going out into the river?
Well, as we can see, they're coming out here, joining this river, and then heading downstream. So you're getting these large amounts of these highly toxic chemicals coming out, going into the river, heading down the river, and out to sea. Every year, there are tons of these chemicals being put out by sewage works, entering the river and going down into the sea, causing environmental damage all the way down. So we know that downstream of sewage work plants like this, there's reduced numbers of dragonflies, reduced numbers of mayflies, reduced numbers of caddisflies. There's a real impact here. It's very difficult to, because it's sewage and it's got lots of other things in, it's very difficult to attribute this to one thing, but we know that's what we expect from these chemicals. All the laboratory work shows that they're so toxic, they're going to impact on dragonfly numbers, they're going to impact on mayfly numbers. Calciprees, downstream of the sewage treatment plants, we're seeing exactly that sort of effect all over the UK. And the levels that we're seeing are really quite shocking. So over 90% of rivers and samples taken in rivers are polluted with fipronil, one of the most dangerous of the insecticides being used. And over 50% of samples from rivers are polluted with imidacloprid, a banned neonicotinoid substance now being used as flea treatments.
So Matt, what sort of levels are actually getting into the waterway?
Toxic levels. So 80% of samples in river exceed the limit at which we know that environmental harm will occur. The damage is absolutely widespread throughout our freshwater systems, particularly in our rivers, but also in lakes. Places like the Broads, one of our national parks, massive areas there full of these chemicals. Natural England estimate that there's been a 90% decline in dragonfly populations in parts of the Broads. This is a national tragedy.
How do we know that these chemicals are actually harming life in our rivers?
Well, there's been a recent study done in Germany where they looked at 15 streams, and these are 15 very rural streams in sort of mountainous forested areas. None of the streams have any sewage plants on them, making this massive noise now as the sewage comes gushing out in front of us. So they're not getting the flea treatments through sewage works in these little forest streams. There's very little human habitation on these streams, so one of the streams had some houses and some properties on there where the flea treatments could be coming from. And what they found was levels of fipronil, which is one of the most persistent PFAS chemicals involved here, that levels of fipronil in those rivers were sufficient to cause a decline in the dragonflies and the mayflies and the caddisflies in those rivers. So they could see impacts directly relating them to the levels of fipronil in those rivers. And the really alarming thing is that the levels of fipronil that they were getting and seeing these impacts in these little forest streams, the levels in those streams were lower. The highest level they recorded was lower than the average level in British rivers. That's absolutely shocking. We know that the levels that we're getting in rivers harm invertebrates. In those streams in Germany, the researchers concluded that rather than from sewage, because there's no sewage in those rivers, the way the flea treatment was getting into those rivers was dogs out on walks with their owners, jumping into ponds and rivers along the way, and the flea treatment's getting released from the animals and directly entering those rivers and directly harming the invertebrates. The levels were lower than we have in the UK generally across the countryside.
So I'm here with Lee. He's a local dog owner, and I just wanted to ask him, what do you know about flea treatments, Lee? Do you know anything about flea treatments, what chemicals they are or what they do?
I have absolutely no idea at all. We buy our flea treatment from the local pet shop, and all we do is read up on it in terms of the harm it can cause our dog, but nothing else.
Fair enough. Were you aware of sort of precautions that sometimes they recommend about not letting dogs go in the water and that sort of thing?
None at all. The only thing I suppose we read up on is when we put the flea treatment on the dog is to not go near that area on the animal to stroke it, because we have children, is to not stroke the animal because it can be harmful to humans.
Gotcha.
But we don't read up on anything in terms of going in lakes or anything, and rivers.
Fair enough. And what's your dog called?
Tilly.
Does Tilly like going in the water?
She loves it.
Gotcha.
She's always going in the water.
Gotcha.
Labrador, they all love it.
Yeah, absolutely.
So so I can see why you're doing this, because if she's got a flea treatment on her, going in the river, then it's likely to come off and go into the water.
You know, as a dog owner, if someone offered a product that was better for the environment,
Absolutely.
would that be something you'd be interested in?
Yeah. Definitely use it, yeah.
Excellent.
Definitely use it.
Nice one. Lee, would you be surprised to know that actually 90% of British rivers do have detectable levels of these harmful toxins that are found in the flea treatments, and that can cause a significant effect detrimentally on the sort of aquatic life there, invertebrate life in the rivers?
It would surprise me. I would have thought that the owners or these companies that provide or do the flea treatment would have done their due diligence, knowing that could happen. So that would surprise me that the rivers are intoxicated with those substances. It would surprise me, yeah.
So what other sources are there for these chemicals potentially coming into British waterways?
So the vast majority of the imported fipronil and imidacloprid come in as flea treatments. But that's not necessarily the only way. In other countries, these chemicals are still licensed for agricultural use, which means that some chemicals will be coming in as residues. And that means that over here, we've got these various produce, and the government has a thing called the
maximum
residue level, and that sets the
maximum
level of pesticides that are allowed to be on produce like this that are brought into the UK. To check whether that's happening or not, they have a monitoring program. That means that we have data, so we can look at how much chemical is coming into the UK on these sorts of products. So if we have a little look here, we see we've got black grapes here from Chile. We've got sweet corn from Senegal. We've got blueberries here from Morocco. These chemicals that are used on these, often they're not regulated to the same standards in the UK. So you can get fipronil and imidacloprid sometimes being imported on food. But the levels are quite low. So looking at the data that's available, it's probably only 1 or 2 or 3 kilograms of pesticide that are being imported on food crops. A much bigger unknown is how much of that pesticide is getting imported on flowers. So here we have cut flowers. If we're talking about cut flowers or pot plants, there are no maximum residue levels. So the government has no monitoring. So we don't know what's on these. And there have been studies. There was a study by the Danish government which actually found quite high levels of fipronil on cut flowers imported into the EU. So the pesticides are not being used in the EU where they're banned, but they're being used overseas in places like Kenya and South America, and then imported into the UK, bringing those chemicals in with them. And actually, particularly for fipronil, there might be quite a bit of chemicals coming in on this. And again, when people are handling cut flowers, it gets on their hands. There was a study in Belgium where florists had large amounts of these pesticides on their hands after handling the flowers. Obviously, if you wash your hands, then some of that will go down the drains and get into the rivers. But we're talking about much less than 5% of the annual burden of fipronil that can get into rivers. In fact, even with fipronil, if you considered all of those other potential sources of fipronil coming into the UK, and you said that all of that got into our freshwater aquatic ecosystem, got into the rivers, it would only account for a maximum of 3% of the pollution we're seeing in our river system. Yeah.
So what about the historic use of these chemicals when they were being used in agricultural purposes? What effect does that have today?
Well, fipronil was only ever used in a very low amount in the UK, so we can pretty much discount agricultural legacy for fipronil use. But imidacloprid was used at high levels, so there were 300 tonnes of imidacloprid used in agricultural fields in the UK. And quite a chunk of that will still be out there in the environment. This is a persistent chemical, and some of that, which is being soils and in agricultural fields, is slowly making its way down into rivers and out into the sea. It's very difficult to quantify how much of that agricultural legacy imidacloprid is contributing to the levels we're seeing in rivers at the moment. The best thing we can do is to look at what's happening at fipronil, where we don't have that confusing factor of how much agricultural legacy imidacloprid is coming into the watercourses. With fipronil, we can look at that and we can work out that about 40% of the pollution, that's flea treatment pollution. So the 40% of the flea treatment is getting into the rivers and causing that pollution easy, job done. When you look at imidacloprid, if the same thing is happening, we would expect to see at least 40% of the imidacloprid also getting into the aquatic system. There's no reason why, if the way that flea treatments and fipronil containing flea treatments are being used and getting into the aquatic environment, there's no reason why imidacloprid flea treatments don't have exactly the same routes and pathways and levels of pollution getting into the environment.
So Matt, we've talked about how these chemicals are impacting our waterways. What other effects do these compounds have?
Yeah, we're just starting to learn how these very toxic nerve agents are getting into all sorts of places we weren't expecting and causing all sorts of harm that wasn't predicted. So one of the recent studies was a study in the Netherlands where they looked at dandelions in public parks and found really high levels of the toxins in the dandelions. So dandelions like these ones here, when dogs come in and play in the vicinity, roll on the ground, pee, shed fur, they get rained on, those chemicals, the toxic nerve agent chemicals, get washed off them into the ground, onto the plants. And what they found was that plants like dandelions here in public parks are now so toxic that if a butterfly was trying to feed on this, they would be severely damaged, unable to properly reproduce. And the levels in the pollen and nectar in the flowers is sufficient to poison and kill bees and other pollinators. So we've got a real developing problem here. Yes, we know about the aquatic stuff, but there's other issues like the dandelions. And the other one that's increasingly concerning the public is what the impacts are for birds. And what happens there is particularly tragic. Birds, many of them, about 70% of bird species, use animal fur to line their nests. And what's happening is that they're picking up animal fur. Sometimes people are, kindness to their hearts, putting out their animal's fur so the birds can come and get it and use it to line their nests, have nice cosy nests for their baby birds. But the evidence is showing now that fur that the birds are using is heavily contaminated with flea treatments, and those nerve agents are having an effect. More dead baby birds are found in nests with more pollution in them. So the more of the toxic flea treatments get into the nests through the fur, the more dead baby birds you find in those nests. We've got declining populations of blue tits and great tits in the UK at the moment. Perhaps this is why.
So, Matt, this evidence that you presented earlier regarding polluted flowers in Dutch parks affecting pollinators, is that new information in the scientific community?
Well, actually, not entirely. So, when the Veterinary Medicines Directorate authorise these chemicals to be used as veterinary medicines, they have a thing called pharmacovigilance. And pharmacovigilance is where the producers of the chemicals have to report any incidents that occur, whether that's to the animal's health, whether that's to people's health, whether that's to the environment. They have to report any incidents back to the VMD, and the VMD that can then act on those warning signs. Actually, over 10 years ago, there'd already been reports to the VMD, to the Veterinary Medicines Directorate, of incidents involving fipronil flea treatments and the death of beehives, where there's a clear link between kennels next to the beehives, and in another case, dogs that had recently been treated going near the beehives, and then those beehives having a massive die out. Unfortunately, it doesn't look like VMD did anything in response to these red flags, and hence it's been left to independent scientific researchers in the Netherlands to start to reveal the potential risk that these flea treatments present, not just to aquatic life, but also to all insect life. And as we know, insect life is in massive decline at the moment, and this poorly regulated veterinary medicine market is one of the reasons why we're having these big declines in our invertebrate populations.
So, Matt, it seems like we don't know a huge amount about these chemicals. Why is it that we do know so much more about fipronil and imidacloprid?
Well, as I said, these are agricultural chemicals, and as a result, they came up, because they were damaging bee populations, they got flagged up as being potential risks in aquatic habitats as well. This meant that the EU required all the member states to start monitoring whether these things were occurring in the environment. In 2017, I managed to get hold of this data. It was quite hard. I managed to get hold of this data about the levels of imidacloprid and fipronil in watercourses. And I did a review of that data, and I was surprised to find imidacloprid in streams and rivers in which there was no agricultural inputs at all. So they couldn't be coming from agricultural use of these chemicals. So where were they coming from? Well, the only obvious source for this imidacloprid was sewage. And I did a calculation just looking at Leeds and looking at the Wick Beck and looking at the amount of imidacloprid that was occurring in Wick Beck and the numbers of cat and dog owners in Leeds and how often they might be treating their pets. And I worked out that if about 30% of the flea treatment use was getting into the river systems, then that would cause the sorts of levels of pollution that we were observing in those rivers. that original back of an envelope estimate, there's now been a lot more science done, and it looks to be about right. Perhaps 40% of fipronil, perhaps 40% of imidacloprid that's used as flea treatments ends up getting into our rivers and going down to the sea.
So, Matt, what if VMD refused to ban these chemicals?
Well, if the chemicals keep on being used and keep coming through homes and into sewage treatment plants like this, then the problem doesn't stop. The pollution problem is still there. And we've got government agencies like the Environment Agency in England, SEPA in Scotland, the National Resources Wales in Wales, who are charged with protecting us from pollution in rivers. And to do that, they have to get on top of this problem as well. So if the VMD, the Veterinary Medicines Directorate, allow this pollution to continue, then it has to hit the next layer of protection for the environment, and that's how we manage sewerage. So some of the sewage going through this treatment plant here behind us will be coming from kennels, from vet practices, from people who are keeping larger numbers of dogs or doing dog walking. You know, there are pet pooch boutiques. All of these sorts of establishments will have a high level of flea treatments coming out in their sewage. That should be treated as trade waste, and companies should not be allowed to put in pollutants into rivers when they contain high levels of these very toxic insecticides. So that means that those agencies will have to get on top of that issue. That means that they have to start regulating those chemicals in all of those different trade wastes and then in the sewage works like this. To stop the pollution, you then need to put in a second line of defence, and that would be those 9,000 sewage treatment plants upgraded to the point where they can actually deal with these chemicals and take them out of the sewage. That is incredibly expensive. The other thing that could be done is that VMD could place more requirements on people so that when they buy the products, they have to take much greater care to stop those getting into the sewage system. What would that look like? Well, we know that these chemicals are still on the pets 28 days and longer after they've been treated. So that's 28 days where the pets shouldn't be being allowed to go into rivers and into lakes and jump into water bodies. That's 28 days where really whenever you stroke that pet, you're going to end up putting those chemicals into the environment. How do you manage that? Well, VMD could insist that people who buy these products only stroke their pets wearing gloves and dispose of those gloves to landfill, to keep their pets indoors so that they don't go outside and pollute the environment for a month or two after they've been treated. These are not achievable ends. They're going to be incredibly unpopular. People aren't going to be doing them and it won't work. So really, you know, conclusion on my review that I've done for Wildlife and Countryside Link is that the best thing to do is to treat this at source, to tackle the problem, you know, at source and to ban those chemicals. There's 20 other effective flea treatments out there. So why these two that are now causing an environmental crisis need to continue to be permitted to be allowed to be used is a very difficult question, and I haven't got the answer.
Has the government got any plans to tackle this problem?
Well, the government produced a flea treatment roadmap last year. Now, the flea treatment roadmap was widely criticised because it lacked any timescales and it lacked an endpoint. But it basically said, we think the problem is a serious pollution problem. We're going to find out some more information. We're going to improve our advice to the public, and we're going to get an international body called VICH, which is a body that has a set of guidelines, and one of those guidelines is about environmental risk assessment. And currently, veterinary medicines for pets do not have to have any environmental impact assessment. No one has to work out how much of this is going to get into the environment. No one has to work out whether that's going to cause an environmental impact. It's incredibly lax. You know, compare that with pesticides, the regulation of veterinary medicines falls far below the standards we have for preventing highly toxic chemicals getting into the environment. And Vitch's guidelines occur in the government roadmap because the government roadmap basically says we're going to get Vitch to do a review of these guidelines so that there's new guidance in place, and then we're going to apply that guidance so that we at that point look at whether those flea treatments are environmentally acceptable or not. Now the thing with Vitch is that Vitch is a body made up of only 3 organisations, the United States, Japan and the EU. The UK is not even a member, we're an observer, so we don't have any real say in what Vitch does in terms of setting standards. However, it's not just the governments that are involved in this, it's also the industry. So the manufacturers of these flea treatments are involved integrally in making the decisions about the management and the risk assessment of their own products. And what happened was the EU, when they became aware of this issue of flea treatments getting into rivers at high levels, went to Vitch and said, we want to do a revision of the assessment, the environmental assessment guidelines that you have. Vitch turned around last November, after the government published their roadmap, which had this as the key step in their roadmap, is this risk assessment review. They turned around in November and they said, we're not going to do it. And at that meeting, 2/3 of the committee members and the coordinators at that meeting were workers in the industry. These are the people who benefit from selling flea treatments. You know, just in the UK, the market for just one of these flea treatments is worth £60 million a year. This is big business globally. We're talking billions of pounds of income, and they refused to review the guidelines. That means that the government's whole plan, their whole roadmap, is thrown off course because they have no plan in place to undertake any environmental risk assessment of any of these chemicals. And the Veterinary Medicines Directorate has said that they will not consider banning them. I don't understand this at all. This doesn't seem to be what the legislation says should be happening. In this day and age, we should be protecting our environment from these dangerous nerve agents in a much more coordinated and thought through way, using that science, using that evidence to put in place good decisions that protect the environment, not allowing the continued pollution of waterways, parks, seas with chemicals that we know are massively destructive to ecosystem and to the health of the environment. I've done a review of the whole topic, so looked at all of the science out there about the fate and the pathways that these chemicals are taking, the impacts they're having in the environment, the levels at which they become toxic, where they're coming from, the whole budget of what's going on with these chemicals. And I've produced a review for an organisation called Wildlife and Countryside Link. And that's an organisation of all the NGOs in the country who are concerned about wildlife and the countryside. And in this review, I've looked across at some of these things and done some new analysis as well. And one of the things that I've done with this is looked at the levels of pollution that we've got in the rivers and lakes at the moment, and the seas and estuaries, and worked out how much do we have to reduce the current inputs of fipronil and imidacloprid to get those pollution levels in our rivers down to acceptable levels. And what it comes out with is a calculation that we need to reduce the amount of fipronil we're using by 98% and the amount of imidacloprid that we're using by 84%. These are massive reductions to try to achieve. My report makes 43 recommendations for things that need to happen to fix the flea treatment pollution crisis. And top of that list is that VMD, the Veterinary Medicines Directorate, have to get a grip of this problem at source. They have to look at what are these chemicals, making sure that the chemicals are safe before they get released into people's homes, before they get released into sewage treatments, and before they end up polluting our rivers and killing our wildlife. But they're not doing that at the moment. Quite why, you'll have to ask VMD, but the law sets out a framework and a structure for what to do in a circumstance where a veterinary medicine starts to impact the environment. And when that new information becomes available, and there's a wealth of scientific information available here, when that new information becomes available, the law says that the Veterinary Medicines Directorate has to undertake a review. They've got a thing called an assessment report. That assessment report has to be revised, and they have to address the environmental concerns in that assessment report, and then make regulatory changes to how those chemicals are being used and whether those chemicals are authorised at all. So that's the first thing that needs to happen. The law needs to be followed, the process that's set out in law needs to be dealt with, and we need to have a reassessment of whether these chemicals are safe to go into the environment.
So Matt, it seems to me that the easiest solution to this problem is just to ban those two chemicals. If the government did go ahead and do that, what would happen next?
Yeah, there are 20 odd alternative chemicals that are already authorised for use. So people wouldn't have difficulty getting flea treatments for their pets. But there is a real risk here, because if we get rid of fipronil and imidacloprid, then we enter into a slightly unknown zone. So because imidacloprid and fipronil were agricultural insecticides, they've actually been quite well studied. So we know quite a lot about their fate, which means where they go in the environment. We know quite a bit about how toxic they are and what impacts they have, and whether they're in rivers. The alternatives, particularly those that are only authorised as flea treatments and haven't been pesticides, we know a lot less about them. This is a mystery box of chemicals. We know that they're all highly toxic in aquatic environments, but we don't know whether they're getting into rivers. We don't know whether those pathways from cats and dogs are the same. So there's a risk that we just shift from fipronil and imidacloprid poisoning into poisoning by a number of other almost just as toxic chemicals. Now, some of the chemicals are different. They're less persistent, or they are applied by tablets instead of pour-ons, and it may be that those chemicals are a bit easier to control, so that we can have fewer of those chemicals actually reaching sewage works, actually getting into the water systems. It may be that some of them are worse. Until we start really looking in the rivers and looking in the sewage and seeing what of these chemicals are going through, we don't really know. So there's a really important message here, which is that it's not just about fipronil and imidacloprid, which is where the government's focusing their attention. It's also about understanding the other flea treatments and what their impacts are and where they are occurring in the environment. And that research and work hasn't been done at all. We have no idea about even the third highest, fluorelana, which is used in thousands of kilograms of that every year. Don't know whether that's getting into rivers. We know that it can do. There's been studies showing that dogs pee in water, and that pee can contain some of the flea treatments that are taken as tablets. Are they polluting the environment? We don't know. No one has looked. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done to make sure that we don't just shift this problem from one chemical to another. And indeed, we need to get away from the prophylactic approach, where people are just treating their animals in case they get fleas, to where they're using these important but highly smear-level toxicity chemicals a lot less. So how can we shift that marketplace from relying on the most toxic chemicals to invertebrates that anyone's ever invented, to having perhaps chemicals that are not quite so toxic? So maybe they repel the fleas rather than killing them, because if you're just repelling the fleas, you're probably not killing everything else as well. And that's about innovation. That's about having clear regulation so that if a chemical is shown to be damaging the environment, it's withdrawn. That will create a market pressure to get better chemicals as flea treatments that are less harmful. And also, we know that the British Veterinary Association is already quite active on this. They're very concerned about the impacts, and we need the vets also to get off that bandwagon of prophylactic treatment and to make sure that fleas and ticks are treated when they occur as a problem, not just prophylactically. Really cut down the usage and the amount of treatments of flea treatments that are happening in the UK every year, so that the amounts of chemicals needed are much lower than they are at the moment. There's also work that could be done looking at potentially better alternatives. You know, there are a lot of essential oils, effectively, that are also actually, some of them are very toxic to fleas, and some of them repel fleas. Difficulty is that because you can't patent them and make money out of those chemicals, because they're naturally occurring substances, they never get put forward as flea treatments. So they are sold actually often as being flea repellents, even when they kill fleas, because they haven't gone through that authorization process, which enables the producer and the manufacturer and the salespeople to say that they kill fleas. And finding a way that actually we can start to look at some of those alternative chemicals, and maybe there are safer ones there that we could get authorized, so people have other options that are much less environmentally harmful than these highly, highly toxic insecticides we're currently using.
So it's a lot of information to take in, and like most of you, prior to starting this project with Matt, I was completely clueless about this issue. It's pretty clear to me now that we have a major disaster happening right before our eyes in this country. And through the research that Matt and other scientists have done, it's clear that we can solve this problem. Now, it's complicated, but that problem solving needs to start with proper regulation and the removal of these chemicals from the market so that they can no longer get into our rivers, parks, and environment. Now you can help by sharing this video, and by sharing Matt's report, which is linked below. We can start to spread some awareness and hopefully put some pressure on the government, on VMD and these other regulatory bodies to do their jobs properly and actually protect us and our environment from these highly toxic chemicals which are currently devastating invertebrate populations across this country. And those invertebrates are a key element of our ecosystem. We must stop this pollution in this country now. So, help us. Let's solve the problem.